really pleased to have this panel here today. I'm going to tell you who everyone is, and then I'm going to allow them to tell you about themselves. So first I'd like to welcome Anna Maria Hubert from the University of Calgary School of Law, George Lidgett from ATCO, Alan Châtenay from Explor, and Keith Chaulk from, oh my God, you've been there only a week?
Yeah.
From?
Stantec.
Stantec,
Yes.
Mine gone blank. I will maybe start with Keith, and we'll have a little bio from everybody, and then I'll have a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the group.
Well, thanks, Maribeth. So my name's Keith Chaulk. I just joined Stantec recently as a senior ecologist based here in Calgary. I was born and raised in Labrador, and I think most of you might recognize that Labrador kind of forms the southern edge of the Arctic in eastern Canada, which ties into the theme of this conference, which is Arctic on the Edge, I think. I spent much of my professional career working on northern, indigenous, environmental and education issues. I have some experience on different co-management boards. I was previously on the Voices Bay Environmental Management Board, which oversaw the environmental performance of a large nickel mine in northern Labrador. That was a co-management board between the Innu and the Inuit and the various levels of government. I was also on the Nunavut Government Land Use Planning Authority, which is another form of a co-management board. And it's a real privilege to be here today. And I just want to thank Dr. Murray and the Arctic Institute team and the University of Calgary for hosting us.
Hi, my name's Alan Châtenay. I'm the president at Explor. Been there since 2002. Born and raised in Calgary, so I've been here my whole life. But first went north and began working in the Arctic in 1988. I've stayed there in one form or another, more or less continuously throughout that period. First half of my career was spent with Schlumberger. During that time, led the negotiations with Schlumberger to form a joint venture that exists present day with the Inuvialuit. It was the first of its type, not only in that region, but also globally for Schlumberger. So it was quite an adventure putting that together, and I'm proud that it still exists today, although activity levels are dramatically lower today. So Explor, what we do is we're a company that focuses on the geosciences. As the name implies, we help our clients find oil and gas, and we've done a ton of work, hundreds of millions of dollars of work cumulatively in the Northwest Territories, the Yukon, throughout the North Arctic and subarctic.
Okay. Hi, I'm George Lidgett with ATCO. Spent 37 years with them now. Obviously, the gray hair has meaning. And through that part of my career, spent a lot of time in our natural gas business, and then moved on to our structures and our military support businesses, and most recently back into our natural gas and electricity businesses. So through that period of time, spent a lot, I guess, more in our Frontec and structures business in the north. We operated the North Warning System, spent a lot of time in Resolute Bay, Nunavik, Iqaluit, Baker Lake, all across the north, and working with local communities in terms of some of their development and setting up businesses together. So I look forward to having some chats about some of that as we move forward.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anna Maria Hubert. I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Law here. I would say that my expertise is more Arctic adjacent. And so I work on areas of international law of the sea, international environmental law, including climate change. I do some human rights and international regulation of science and emerging technologies. And so today I probably will bring more of a global conceptual view to some of these issues, but I think it'll be an interesting engagement in terms of the local and the global and the practical and the more theoretical aspects of that international law brings to this conversation.
Great, thanks. So, I'm sure you can hear me, but so I'm going to open up the discussion here by asking each of our panelists to talk a little bit about their perspectives on what they think the biggest issues are in the Arctic, and how those issues might resonate outside of the Arctic, and particularly in the rest of Canada. And so I can maybe I'll just go in the same order and start with Keith.
Sure. Well, earlier today, we heard a lot of talk about different types of change, especially change focused on climate, which obviously is true and is happening. When I asked what is some of the biggest risks to the Arctic and the North, I think it's change generally, even beyond climate change. Obviously, climate change will drive a lot of the physical changes in the North, but there's so many other types of changes that are going on there as well, related to community health and loss of language or culture, population changes, economic changes, governance changes. And I think that would be an underlying theme for me, would be that change is probably one of the biggest threats to the North generally, which includes climate change, of course.
From my side, I think it's really, and I think a lot about the Canadian Arctic. There's the Arctic, the larger picture, and I think some of the perspective that I carry is a sense that in Canada we're really missing some significant opportunity for economic development for a variety of reasons. Ultimately, I think that has the risk of potentially threatening our sovereignty in the North. There's no question that there are an enormous amount of resources that are incredibly valuable that remain untapped and not accessed in the North, in Canada, and I think we risk losing the North and the Arctic if that stays that way for a very long period of time. So I'm quite concerned about that. That extends to the subarctic. Most recently, 2012, 11, 12, 13. We had an opportunity in the subarctic, the central Mackenzie Valley. Canada had the opportunity to develop a massive resource. We let that one pass us by as well, and the result is an absence of prosperity in that part of the world. So I'm worried about that.
You guys have hit all the highlights. I think it's a core understanding of the same themes here, that climate change, or however you wish to term it yourselves, but there is a climactic, I don't want to use the word emergency, but certainly a climactic problem that's facing the North, and its long-ranging implications to the people of the North, whether it's sea levels rising, however you want to look at it, but really it's livelihood and to culture. That as things change, the biodiversity is changing around them, and their substantive way of life is changing. And spending time up in some of the communities, it is, from their perspective, one of the largest issues in their own minds, and something we have to be conscious of. But in terms of the overarching view, I absolutely agree with Alan that as things change, we lose ice cap and waterways become more prevalent. What is Canada going to do about its own sovereignty? What it's going to do with its lands? It is sparsely populated. Largest piece of the land we have in our nation, right, as I think it was of 2017, is 120,000 people. And is that a claim to property? That's the thing that really worries me the most. And we get challenged today. We're challenged by various nations just trudging through our waterways. And is that the right thing? And how do we protect our rights on an international level? That's off to you now.
Nice hands-off.
Thank you. So I obviously approach this more from someone who studies international legal frameworks, and to some extent we would include regional frameworks as well in that. And so the sort of, I think, bigger question for me is, it's true that we're seeing major and accelerating environmental changes in the Arctic, notably from climate change. So if you had an opportunity already to read the IPCC's most recent report on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing Arctic, in a changing climate, you'll see sort of the widespread impacts already that marine ecosystems, and because I work on marine issues, the marine environment is facing, but also a lot of uncertainty about how the environment will change in the future and how rapidly. And so the question is, what does this mean for law and legal frameworks? And I think we have here a bit of a conceptual problem. So these big environmental changes, we can think of them as being a disruptive force to law, and in a way, difficult for legal frameworks to handle. So we expect legal orders to be stable and coherent and produce legal certainty and the rule of law. We do have law in this area that's been in place for quite a while already, since going back before the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which does apply, for example, to marine ocean areas, as well as a number of other environmental law frameworks. But then the question is, how does law need to change and adapt in the face of certain forces? And I would maybe just like to point to some of the ways in which environmental change disrupts legal frameworks. First of all, environmental change, the causes and consequences are polycentric. And so this means that environmental change is caused by cumulative and indirect impacts from human activities from a range of sectors, scales, and across different countries. And one of the things in the Arctic is we can think about the causes of environmental damages coming from elsewhere, from south, and the impacts are being felt most acutely in a place where a lot of people haven't been or don't think about. And so the question is, who has standing to govern in this space? There are parts of the Arctic Ocean that are high seas, the Central Arctic Ocean. Who has standing? Is this something where we should consider more regional influences, or do global instruments, should they be more directed towards special issues in the Arctic, or are simply existing instruments sufficient? There are also a lot of uncertainties, and that creates a lot of the instability in knowledge, creates a lot of uncertainty about how you make legal frameworks that are adaptive and over time. And there's a lot of social and economic and political controversy that comes with this. Should we protect the Arctic and keep it as pristine as possible to protect resiliency, for example, or should we open it up as an opportunity for development? These are conflicts that are not just about science, they're about values. And I think it'll be very contentious in terms of who has a say and who governs, even amongst the group of states in place. And fourth and finally, the physical world, because the physical world is changing, we have to acknowledge that legal regimes are going to be in a state of flux as well, and operate with that assumption. And that means providing some certainty, balancing certainty off against more adaptive, flexible, inclusive frameworks.
Okay, great. So, we clearly have very different views, but I think overlapping views of what's happening in the North today. And I'd like to just maybe drill down a little bit into the areas of expertise of each of our panelists. And then already I'm getting good questions from somebody out there. I don't know where they are.
I see people typing.
In space.
Actually, I have the app too, so I might ask a question.
Are you asking your own questions?
Yes.
Not allowed to ask yourself a question. So I'm just going to start and bring it back to Keith, and if you could talk a little bit about, and particularly thinking about what Anna Maria and George and Alan had to say, some of the particular challenges that you've dealt with or that you're aware of, that you see coming down the road with respect to the co-management of resources in the Canadian Arctic, whether those are renewables or non-renewables.
Sure. Okay. Well, that's a great question. Complicated question, of course. I'm trying to think where to begin. I mean, as long as humans have been around, they've been interacting with their environment, and that interaction implies some type of management. Use that word loosely with the environment. They choose to hunt here, or choose to hunt at this time, or extract this resource. So the management of natural resources has been around for many years. So kind of focus more on a modern type of approach. And even that has a certain history going back, to some treaties that were signed by various colonial powers. We would like to extract this resource. Will you give us your permission? And quickly those treaties were forgotten. Come along the modern era, and we see with some major industrial projects in the north, a greater appreciation that many of the decisions that are made by powers that be elsewhere based on values and worldviews, not necessarily held by the people where the resources are being developed. And it's through this, this realization, I think there's been a movement towards greater indigenous participation in decision making. And it's been a driver of these co-management regimes for a while now. I'm not quite sure when the first official co-management board was created in Canada. I know the first one that I was involved with was the Voices Bay Environmental Management Board for that nickel mine. That was in 2003, but co-management existed before that. We had a lot of struggles at that board. The board was composed of representatives from the federal government, the provincial government of Newfoundland and Labrador, the Labrador Inuit, who I represented at that board, and the Innu Nation of Labrador. And our general goal was to increase environmental performance in that particular co-management board. It came about because of the land claim that the Labrador Inuit were advocating for at the time. It predated their land claim, but it was very much built into the way that land claim was developed. Many of the struggles that we had were because of regulatory authorities. So the federal government had regulatory authority for X, Y, and Z, metal mine effluent, environmental protection plans, or the provincial government did. And as Indigenous people on that board, we would often want environmental performance to be much higher than what the standards were set. But because we were dealing with regulators, they were very inflexible. They weren't able to go above what the legislation said, which really got to the heart of why are we doing this anyway if we can't actually make any changes. So that's the fundamental struggle with co-management, when you have people with different worldviews, different value systems, wanting to achieve different things, sitting at the same table, struggling with their political and policy frameworks. And that will continue, that will never go away. Same thing happens at the United Nations. You have 300 countries all fighting with each other. That's the nature of these types of things, but that is fundamentally the struggle is how do you reconcile what may be in the interest of Northerners or Indigenous peoples with what may be in the interest of a government or in the interest of a corporation. And they don't always align. Sometimes they do, and when they do, it's great. But generally speaking, I think as we move more and more into an era of reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous peoples, I think you'll see more and more joint ventures, Indigenous peoples as decision makers, having a say in how things are developed and the frameworks under which they fall. And I think that's what the future holds, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah. Okay, so I think following, and I have some questions that actually pertain from the audience specifically to the issue of Indigenous voices, so we'll come back to that, but I think probably all three of the rest of our panels will touch on that issue as well. So I'm just going to follow up there from that and ask Alan if you could talk a little bit about what you think the or give us a sort of a vision from your perspective of the long-term view on development in the Arctic.
Well, I think it's really for us to decide. I mean, the first time I went up, because long terms can mean different things to different people. So if we talk 20 to 50 years, so it's amazing, I'm coming up on over 30 years of being in the north. And when I first went up, it looked like a Molligak might get developed and built in very short order. It looked for a time when we were negotiating the joint venture with the Inuvialuit, like the Mackenzie Gas project might get developed. That didn't happen. It looked about almost a decade ago now like we would be developing a massive, fantastic shale resource in the central Mackenzie Valley. That didn't happen. So I think the question is really one that, speaking just about Canada here, one that Canadians have to ask is the Arctic a place to be, or is the Arctic a place not to be when it comes to resource development? Because so far, we've really seen it stall. And then you talked about, you referenced some treaties, Keith, that were established by colonial powers. We see kind of a new version of that in the establishment, the unilateral establishment of the offshore moratorium by the federal government, really without consultation. And many businesses in the Inuvialuit settlement region, for example, were counting on offshore development for their own prosperity. They were excited because they just created the Inuvik-Tuk Highway. That didn't happen, and so that's profoundly disappointing. So what does the Arctic hold? Enormous potential. If we decided we wanted to get after it, as the Alaskans have and as the Russians have, and working with the Chinese, we could do that. The economics are there, unquestionably. The resources there, and the prosperity could follow. So it's a question of what do we want to do as Canadians, and will the regulations support that?
Okay, and so, George, just picking up on that theme, maybe you could speak a little bit to the issue of capacity building and development in the North.
Maybe I'll bring it back a little bit first to joint venture structures. Actually, I'm very proud of what we've done in our corporation over our history. And I'll take it back to North Warning System, which I talked about, because that was one of the first entries into the North for our company. And that's operating the North Warning System in Canada and under a separate company in Alaska for the US part of the North Warning System. And when that first started 30 years ago, when we operated Canada for 25 years, continued to do so in the US, it was ATCO. And about 5 years into that, so now you're saying 25 years ago, the local population wanted to be part of this. So we created a joint venture structure. And the very interesting part of it is an organization called Pan-Arctic Inuit Logistics was created, which was all 7 economic development corporations of all of the Inuit across the north, the Innu, Inuvialuit, and the Inupiat in Alaska, came together under one business, joint ventured with ATCO on a full 50-50 partnership. So when you go to talking about how do you manage things into the future, I can say from experience that when you get into a full partnership in that kind of structure, everybody has a voice. The concerns that were levied from our partners in terms of paying attention to the environment were absolutely heard and actioned. Because it's not just what is prescriptive with the contract with the government, it also has flow through in terms of treatment of the environment. And that's what taught us a lot. And as the years have progressed in the North, we hold full joint ventures in Iqaluit for fuel supply, up in Resolute Bay. Through that same Pan-Arctic Inuit Logistics, we operate the alert base for the Canadian Forces, and so on and so on. There's a long list, but what the interesting part is it is always a full joint venture. The same with the Inupiat in Alaska. And then you get to the right spot, I believe. And that taught us a lot. As we moved south of 60, that's the same structure that we use wherever we go. Because if you tend to use that other structure, which can be 90% corporate, 10% indigenous population, there is no voice at the table, to your point earlier. So if you want to get to true co-management, as you were talking about, it's got to be equal. But if you want to build capacity, you also have to be able to have structured within your agreements the ability for the local nation to take over themselves. We were partnered in what was called Tlicho Logistics, and within that agreement, and some we have in south of 60, was the ability of the local indigenous population, when they're ready, to actually take on the full business opportunity. And if you do that structure right, you start building capacity. And if you bring it just right down to a local level, if I go back to the North Warning System example, it started quite humbly and small. It was not a large operation, about 260 people roughly, and of which 140 were in the north. It started off very small in terms of trained local people, but grew to over 40%. So that training involved going to colleges to take on supervisory positions, trade schools to become techs to operate the North Warning System itself. And now they're at a point, if they wish to bid independently, they can. And that's part of building capacity, but it's only so big. Because we have a population base, as I mentioned earlier, about 120,000 piece across all of the territories. So if you're going to get into serious economic development, and maybe this might be a contentious statement, but I firmly believe also that the potential is very large in both the natural gas sector and the resource or the mineral sector in terms of the wealth of resources. We are infrastructure constrained for certain to move that product. But I'll leave you with a thought in terms of what it could mean in terms of north. But that means there's southerners moving north to help support that. It then goes back to cultural issues, loss of language. So you have to be very careful how you do this. And if you think of it this way, because it does counter, or sort of counterintuitive on culture, counterintuitive on the environment to develop a natural gas resource. But if you think of it just a little different, both can coexist and to the betterment of where we are today, climactically, on a worldwide scale. One large world-scale LNG facility, like one being built on the west coast of Canada, with the amount it transports to the Asian marketplace, would displace 40 coal-fired power plants. So burning coal to natural gas is the equivalent of removing 90 million tons of CO2 from our environment. That's 12% of what Canada puts out annually. So if you think of it that way, there can be a coexistence. And I know we had a great debate at the table earlier, but maybe it's controversial for some, but you can see where you can get economic development and create business for the north and build capacity and at the same time do benefits to our environment by producing something that we have abundance of and we should be proud of. And I'm waiting for the questions.
Yeah, oh yeah, they're coming. So I just, I think, I was going to ask Anna Maria something specifically, but I'm going to change my mind about that because I think all three of you have talked in some way, shape, or form about sovereignty and about Indigenous rights. And so I would like to ask you to speak to those issues with respect to the discussion that we're having and how that, where that sits in terms of for example, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, on our international agreements around everything from, the law of the sea to other kinds of things, because I think that is intimately related to what we've already been talking about.
Yeah, so we would, as an international legal scholar, I see these issues in terms of areas within and areas beyond national jurisdiction. And so in terms of the land and marine entitlements, so 12 nautical miles off the coast, we have the territorial sea in which the coastal state has sovereignty. And beyond that, 200 nautical miles, the coastal state has sovereign rights in the living and non-living resources and jurisdiction over the environment and marine scientific research and installations and so forth. Beyond that, though, is an area beyond national jurisdiction, the Central Arctic Ocean. And as international lawyers see this as global commons. And so the question is being debated, including a new treaty that's under negotiation under the auspices of the United Nations General Assembly, which is what is the legal status that applies to high seas areas and the deep sea bed. And one of the ideas is that we should call this the common concern of humankind. And so we have a debate at the international level, at least in terms of how do we think about global commons areas, and a very different perspective that's being advanced by the 5 coastal Arctic states, as well as the Arctic Council, and sort of going out from there in terms of their idea that they are stewards of the Arctic and should lead and be proactive in some way. So we've seen this 2018 agreement to prevent unregulated high seas fisheries Fisheries, we often have regional measures, so that's non-controversial, but the extent to which, for example, a global universal treaty should specifically govern the Central Arctic Ocean and what that means in terms of the requirements, or whether we should have carve-outs or special articles in place for that part of the world is, I think, still quite contested. Yeah. And I would say also from a global perspective and from a climate change point of view, for a long time, we've had this idea of sustainable development, and it's developed over time, this idea of balancing economic and social development against the environment. And I think the world is really, that idea is really fracturing when we see like real concern about existential risk to humanity and non-human nature. I think people are starting to think differently about opportunities of oil and gas resources in the Arctic, and that's really changing the politics probably in the South. And so it's also what, when you see an opportunity, it's like a question of like scale, where is it local, regional, or international, and who has a say, and do the existing ways of thinking about these things in law, are they adequate given the risks that we face?
Yeah. So actually that would bring me back to you, George, and given that Anna Marie has brought up this whole issue of sustainability and looking at some of the legal issues around policy that eventually could bring us back to climate, and a question from the audience. So I'm going to pick on you first,
Sure.
right? Because technically I think I might work for you in a way because you're on our board of directors. But so this is from Anonymous. It is interesting that the ATCO representative notes climate change is one of the biggest challenges ahead. What are ATCO's climate policies?
Well, it's a great question. Well, you probably have read, well, first off, I'll back this off. We do have climate policies in our corporation and looking at ways to reduce on a continualized basis. If I take our natural gas sector, we were able to reduce what I view as much worse than a CO2 level, which is methane emissions, by 30%. And to the point where we actually made money doing that, believe it or not, because you can sell CO2 credits. So while we want to do the right thing, if you can actually monetize that, which at the end of the day go to the customers of ours, that's a great thing. So what you have to do is look at how you can do that. The other part that we have just done is sold our long life thermal generating assets across Canada. Now, there's two reasons for that. One is we had a lot of coal-fired that we don't believe is part of the mix of energy that makes sense for our business going forward. Even though you can convert them, we believe that as we move forward as a company, that we will look at different forces of energy generation. We did keep our hydro assets, and as we develop different assets around the world, we just procured some hydro assets in Mexico, and we'll continue to look into that vein. The other part of what we do is look at, I think the word innovation is overused but I'll say look at things in a different way. And just small examples, at Red Deer College, we installed combined heat and power units, natural gas fired, but it's localized generation. And it takes the hot water, just like any cogeneration does, and it was going in to feed their boiler system. So you can take that residual heat that used to be centrally generated, and you can localize it, which is called distributed energy. We combine that with solar and some battery technologies to the point where their payout period is actually very low from an economic perspective for the Red Deer College, doing the same thing at Mount Royal College. So businesses are now looking at that, and it's a product we bring to market for them that allows them to reduce it. Efficiency-wise, if you want to just get into numbers, if you produce locally, you're at about that 90 to 92% efficiency by utilizing the heat combined with solar. If you centrally generate and then distribute by transmission and distribution wires, you run 50 to 52% efficiency in using the same energy source to create that electricity. So that just gives you a perspective of what you can do as a corporation to make things better. Other things we try out, believe it or not, is CO2 sequestration at a localized level. There's a technology that, I should have brought some soap along, and I'll tell you why in a minute. It's actually a unit that we take our exhaust from our boilers at one of our ops centers, and what we've been able to achieve is a 40% reduction in CO2 from that operating center before the installation. What comes out of that is a powder that's not dissimilar to potash, just a little bit off, but starts with a soda ash almost to potash. And you can create soap with it. You mix it with olive oil and a few other things that are natural, and you've got a bar of sequestered CO2. And it's kind of a unique, sounds like a novelty, but it's just one thing you can do with it. You can add it to compost to get for a better value in your compost. So it's little things like that if you can move to market and create the value, I think that's a great thing, and that's where we spend our time. But I think that move off of thermal generation would have been our biggest. You'll see that coming up.
Right. Okay, so I feel like somebody might want to follow up on that from the audience, or are you just going to send them to me? Okay, send them to me. So
There's one here.
Here's one there.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Hi. So I think the anonymous person was asking about your climate policies, and those are all great ideas.
Yes.
Going back and sort of dancing around the question, what are your actual climate policies that you have as a corporation?
Okay, well, I guess definitive policies in our sustainability reporting is our continual drive to reduce our emissions. That's what we do. That is our policy. Is that more specific for you?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you have to look, and the reason I bring that up, because it's not just one thing that you can do. It's a multitude of things that you have to do continually to keep reducing your emissions levels. And that's maybe why I went the way I did. Okay.
Does anyone else want to chime in on this one? It was pretty ATCO specific, but.
Yeah, it was an ATCO question.
Yeah. So I have several questions here that speak to the issue of sovereignty, which is something that we've all touched on. So I'm going to kind of string them together, and I'm going to start with Keith. You can answer this question, but so there's one question which is, how should Canada honor Indigenous voices in this discussion around sovereignty and Arctic sovereignty? And then a second question, which sort of hits the same thing, is do we have the longest undefended border in the world in the Arctic? And I would assume the extension or the next clause in that question would be, and should we do something about it? And do we need to modernize our North Warning System? So there's clearly an interest, and I think it's probably because Rob Hubert scared the life out of everyone in this room earlier today with Russia and China and the United States. But I think those things are all wrapped up together in terms of sovereignty, Indigenous rights, and development, and the legal framework. So I'd like to ask you if you want to address some of those things.
Yeah, well, I certainly can't address the length of our territorial waters and whether it's the longest undefended border. That would be outside my experience or knowledge. The U.S. something there was some other
about where do Indigenous people and Indigenous rights fit in this larger discussion that we're having about sovereignty in the Arctic?
Okay, that's a good question. I was lucky enough a few years back to be asked to be Vice President Indigenous with the University of the Arctic, and through that experience I got to work with Indigenous peoples internationally. The Indigenous Peoples Secretariat in Copenhagen, which included the Arctic Aleutian people, Gwich'in people, Sami, Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North, Inuit Circumpolar Conference, and it's quite interesting to see how their voices are given weight. They're made as permanent participants of Arctic Council, but Arctic Council is composed of about 8 countries, I believe, US, Canada, Russia, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, and so on. I may have some of them wrong. but they don't really have authority per se. They don't, but much like the United Nations, they're a place where people can discuss ideas. So internationally, that's one place where Indigenous peoples are given a special voice to discuss issues around sovereignty and issues that concern them. And many of the circumpolar Indigenous nations have international representative organizations that I just mentioned. More close to home, the best way to get Indigenous voices heard and on the record is by having Indigenous people participate to express their own voice. And that's the only way to do it. To give it to somebody else and have them filter it through a written or some other process is not an Indigenous voice. That's a filtering process, and probably not consistent with UNDRIP or FPIC, free prior informed consent on decision making. So quite simply, there just needs to be more seats at the table for Indigenous people in decision making processes. And that is moving, we're moving that way more and more all the time. And we heard different presentations this morning about, addressing the needs of communities and stuff like that. And to address needs of communities, you need to listen and you need to work with them and build partnerships. And take their knowledge into consideration and those types of things.
So you raised the sovereignty issue in your opening remarks, and I wonder if you want to get into that a little bit more based on the questions from the audience about, what should we be doing? Is the role of sovereignty, how is our presence or non-presence, as some might argue, because there is a small and dispersed population. What role does that have to play in terms of economic development and those kinds of things?
Yeah, they go together. I mean, I think oftentimes, it's sort of back to this question of what does the North mean to everybody? And those of us that are passionate about the Arctic, as I expect everybody in the room is, understands that it's a place to be and we all love it and we want to be there. We might see it in different ways. Sometimes, though, it's easy to lose sight of the global competitive landscape, right? And the reality is that today and across the other side of the Arctic, both the Norwegians, the Russians are developing their LNG at a tremendous pace, changing geopolitical and economic calculations and driving a different kind of prosperity. Prosperity, when you build LNG in Russia, it doesn't disperse in the same way as it would here in Canada. So the thing that I worry about is that losing sight of that global competitive landscape from an economic and resource development perspective might result in us putting the actual underlying sovereignty at risk when it comes to movements through the Northwest Passage and other things. And I've seen Rob present many times, so it doesn't surprise or scare me maybe quite as much as it does some of you. It's something that I think I'm perhaps a little bit more aware of. But the risk is real. There is an element of use it or lose it when it comes to sovereignty and defense. There is no question that we're under-defended in the North. It's not undefended, but it's perhaps not defended quite as well as it ought to be. We're likely not as prepared as we need to be to defend the resources, whether they're developed or undeveloped. They need to be defended. So I think it all ties together.
Do you want to add to that?
No, I think you'd hit the nail on the head. I will talk about, I think one of the questions was the modernization of our North Warning System. Yes. Not much else to say about that.
Slight vested interest.
No, not slight. I guess just from knowledge of, careful what I can say here. It does need, and there is certainly discussions between both the government of Canada and the U.S. about the modernization of the radar system, which would be its third evolution since its inception.
I feel like you might have something to say here.
It's not exactly my area. I was at a meeting, I believe in 2011, at the International Tribunal of Law of the Sea, and a Chinese governmental agent was there and gave a very scary talk about China's interest in the Arctic in an international arbitral seat, what we would call a court. I was sitting next to someone from Foreign Affairs Canada.
Caribou there, the George River herd was almost 700,000, I believe, at one point in the 80s, and I think it numbers less than 20,000 right now, but I'm not up to date on the most recent numbers. That's not uncommon for caribou populations in Canada right now. It's unclear why that's happening in some cases. Many times because of habitat loss. Climate change is obviously a driver. There's been changes in how people use the land. We have way more people now than we used to. In my grandfather's days, there was 2,000 permanent residents in Labrador. We now have 30,000, which doesn't seem like a lot, but if they're all on snowmobiles and they can go 500 kilometers in a day, and they have high-powered rifles that can shoot 1,000 yards, and they're able to haul back this number of caribou, that plays a role as well. That's not to say it's the hunters that are doing it, but there's lots of changes happening on the landscape that didn't happen before. You know, many of them discussed today. What that means for how do you protect these populations, there are better experts than me for sure. There's many different ideas out there about protecting key habitat areas, whether it's calving grounds, limiting activities during certain seasons like calving, managing predator-prey relationships in a greater detail, habitat, I think I said habitat enhancement. So there are ways possibly to help our populations. No, there's also natural fluctuations in animal populations, and that's true for every animal population. They come, if you talk to elders, they will always say that. We often talk about change now, and we try to assign that change to something like climate change, but in the natural world, animal populations do fluctuate. And some of the people that are most knowledgeable about that are people who make their living harvesting on the land. And they will always, if you talk to old people, the elders, they will talk about this. There'll be scarce years when people starve to death, and not that long ago. And so you got to recognize that the populations do go up and down. That doesn't mean that what's happening now is a natural decline in many of the populations we see, but they do go through cycles. It's interesting that they don't normally sync up the way they are now, where there's so many populations in decline. So it raises some flags, but it's hard to piece out what's causing what in some cases. But that's about all I can say on the topic, which is,
Yeah, that's good. So for our part, geophysics is core to our business. Seismic data acquisition is a big part of what we do. There is no doubt that historical seismic data acquisition produced big, long lines across the land, which was very detrimental to caribou. And so that understanding is, we know that now. And we've been, our company specifically has been working very, very hard to develop new technologies. Most recently, we've got a technology we call Pinpoint that actually eliminates seismic lines in the oil sands. So we go from very intensive crisscrossing lines that do change the predator-prey relationships. Wolves, moose, and caribou is sort of the triangle to kind of summarize quickly. And so we're very, very happy about that. And many potential resource development areas in the north could take advantage of that technology. So, there's been so little done in the Canadian Arctic over the last couple of decades that, the next round of exploration will look radically different, radically lower footprint, and be much less impactful on caribou, at least for our part of the industry. It's one of the largest footprints on the landscape. So we're pretty excited about that innovation and development for our part.
Well, I don't think I can add any more than what you've said there, because I'm certainly not a specialist in that area, so you were very eloquent in your answers.
Well, I have a question to follow up, because caribou are a transboundary species, so they don't recognize the border between Alaska and Canada. The occasional intrepid soul that might cross the sea ice between Canada and Greenland, or with respect to development, and I'm thinking about this also in the context of offshore. I do some work with a physicist who has a seismic array off the east coast of Greenland, who's got a an acoustic array off the east coast of Greenland, and she's monitoring the seismic activities from Norway and the impact of that offshore activity on marine life in Greenland. And so I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about those transboundary species and the what sort of legal frameworks or discussions are going on around managing development and protecting those kinds of things that don't recognize borders, like seals and caribou.
Yeah, it's not really something I work on, but anytime you have any sort of transboundary species, and of course you need cooperation, and that entails information sharing about threats and impacts, and information about, you know, where the threats are, what they are, and so forth. And so, yeah, I think part of the problem is that we just have a lack of data. Then there's the question of how you go about what mechanisms are there for sharing it. Are they effective? To what extent is Indigenous knowledge taken into account in that process? And so I think there are a lot of uncertainties there. I think from a really more abstract conservation of biodiversity perspective, we have a sort of different way of looking at biodiversity, which is it is a common concern, and so jurisdiction has a sort of different connotation there, where the concept that applies is that all of the world has an interest in the conservation of biodiversity. So it's not necessarily our caribou, but we see species, flora and fauna as being part of, in a way, our like genetic heritage. And so there are international law mechanisms in the Convention on Biological Diversity for managing that and sharing information as well, not just between governments.
But if I can dive in one last time. So I spoke about land seismic. You know, the culprit, or would-be culprit, at least in marine seismic, is air gun arrays. So what you have is you have air guns that, if not managed properly, can impact marine mammals, no question. But there's some exciting new technology in that field as well. We ourselves don't do offshore seismic acquisition. But the one to keep your eye on is BP's wolf spar technology. It eliminates the air gun, dramatically changes the way that we're coming up with new theories around how geophysics works and testing those. And wolf spar, if you're interested in what's coming, what the future holds, it looks like we might be able to eliminate air guns.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question, the offshore. And I know and I don't know if this is still a topic of discussion, but certainly with respect to the Norwegian regulatory framework, there was some discussion about when we're going to do this work, what time of year, what time of day, in order to kind of try to minimize impact, particularly with respect to the fisheries in Norway itself, but then, you know, across the Barents and all the way over to Greenland and in the Fram Strait. So it is something that I think both governments and private sector are thinking about. And I think we're all familiar with the opposition to offshore from the communities on Baffin Island and Clyde River in particular. So it I think goes back to your point, Keith, about the different tensions between the different entities and organizations and groups, and how do we sort of move that forward to get to the place where it's beneficial to all of us. So we have 6 minutes left, and not surprisingly, there's a whole bunch of questions about the election. And I have to say, because there are 2 faculty members on this stage, that we've been given a stern, I'll get to you, a stern warning about making any kind of political statements with respect to political parties. So I would leave those of you who would like to discuss the election with our panelists to do that at the coffee break. And then I'll come back to you over here at the front of the room from IRC if you had another comment.
In the ISR, you got at Settlement Creek, we have 4 herds of porcupine.
Right.
Cape Bathurst and the Blue Nose. And we have a small herd of woodland. But studying why are they healthy. And another thing, a few years ago I was hunting with my son, and we were on top of a pinwheel. In a few hours we watched these two bears kill about 4 or 5 fawns. That's 2 hours. And we looked around the area, and there was fawn legs all over the place. And there's a lot more grizzly bears now. This year, in Inuvik, there was 20 plus. In Klavik, 13. And our wolves are getting a lot bigger, a lot more bigger packs. The predators are taking advantage of this climate change.
Sure, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Any more questions or comments from the audience? Any non-election questions on my list? No, not really.
I'd just like to follow up on that. That's a really interesting point, because I know it wasn't that long ago, many people where I'm from would trap. We have black bears mainly in where the caribou are, and many of the indigenous people would trap black bear, and there was a bit of a market for that. But because of international regulations on the transport of endangered species, in particular bear galls, which were sold for to market, they look a lot like panda bear galls, so they were prevented and they couldn't be sold internationally. So therefore, the black bear hunting went down. So now we have a very high black bear population in Labrador, and I have seen the same thing. Black bears taking down caribou as well. I have a great picture of one from my early days as a biologist of a black bear with his mouth wrapped around an adult caribou. This is, and so it gets to the point though that there's lots of reasons that animal populations change, and sometimes it is very much the predators, and sometimes this is in response to changes that humans are doing. Where before people were harvesting certain animals more frequently, if they're not trapping or hunting black bears anymore, well, they're released now, and so they can go out and consume more caribou. Right. So there's these things all play with each other. So.
Rob?
Just one issue on the sovereignty issue. Just to be clear, what the Americans are talking, what the Americans and the Europeans, we can't forget that the Europeans are saying the same thing. The Germans have said it in their Arctic policy, the British have said it in their Arctic policy. When they talk about sovereignty, they're talking about the waters of the Canadian North. The Americans are talking about the lands. Lands are fairly accepted. But where it becomes a water issue, where it really affects in terms for Canada and in terms of the indigenous rights, comes to the issue is whether or not the waterways are internal, which means we have complete control, which means that if we want to close part of the waterway down for hunting or any of the other issues, we have the right to do so. If they become international waterways, and this is what the Americans, the British, the Germans, and we think the Scots have all stated, then it means that we do not have the right to impose any limitations in terms of their passages. I mean, the concern that I have, of course, for the sovereignty issue, also all vessels have the right to travel in their mode of normal operation, which means that Chinese and Russian submarines then have the right to go through the Northwest Passage without informing us ahead. So the issue is one of indigenous rights over the waters when they are frozen, and for us it's a security issue in terms of how close we want those submarines if the Americans, the Europeans, in fact, get their way.
Did you want to speak to this, Anna Maria?
Yeah, so the issue here at least from an international law perspective, is whether Canada draws straight baselines all the way around its Arctic archipelago on the outside, and closes in the archipelago and calls that internal waters. And so the basis for that argument is that it has a historical entitlement, which I think is quite a dodgy sort of legal argument. Second relates to the time in which they did that and whether those straight baselines were drawn before new rules were brought in under UNCLOS. And so there's a legal dispute about whether that is or is not internal waters. Obviously the Americans and the rest of the world take a different perspective on that. And then the second issue is whether with international passages, that area will be internationalized. I think the idea that it'll become a strait anytime soon is probably unlikely, but yeah, the sort of legal status of those waters, there's a sort of complex line of legal arguments that you have to get through, and there's, I think, a lot of questions around Canada's arguments as well as the US, which claims that it's a strait.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
The woodland a few years ago, there was a big fire around Yellowknife. They had a small herd of 700. Got real big. Caribou moved away from the fire over to Moderator. 1432 in my land. So when they were traditionally a hunter, I have type and title. But it's really scary. They allow the ships through our area where the policemen are. So if they destroy those, they could destroy our ecosystem. Those are really important. They produce little, I don't know how to research, but they produce a little algae from that. They say that to compete with the forest. They ruin that, they just ruin the whole ecosystem. But I'm not educated.
Did you want to say something?
Nope.
Nope. Well, I think we're at the end of our time. I'd really like to thank this panel for coming here today and taking up our invitation and waging the potentially friendly, not so friendly, super friendly environment. It's been very interesting to hear these different perspectives on business, on development, on Indigenous issues, on the legal framework. And I think just to kind of bring it back to where I ended this morning with my own discussion, it is increasingly clear that as we move into the future and as we think about the North and the people that live there and the rest of our country, that how we deal with the change we're already experiencing and the next 20 years is going to be really critical, and that's something that we need to do in partnership, even if we don't always agree on things.